sand deposit, early 4th dynasty layers, 6th into the 6th dynasty, and then the Middle Kingdom wall is directly cut into these earlier layers, and we have the foundation trench to prove that. So some of the objects that came out, again, not that exciting, but very informative. A lot of beer jars, a lot of bread molds, so bread and beer production, which actually were also used a lot for the upkeep of the offerings. So a temple had a large, usually large economic part attached to it, where food was produced for the daily offerings. And we found such a huge amount of these beer jars and bread molds that this would fit pretty nicely. Plus, this peculiar thing, this is actually a mud jar stopper, so something that would close a large storage jar. And on one of them, we have an imprint, again, of a cylinder seal of a royal seraph, which gives you the horse name of a king. And unfortunately, this piece is extremely fragile and not very well preserved, and it was impossible to actually read the king's name. According to the ceramics, it should be some ruler in the 4th dynasty, but I mean, you can see it's impossible to take a good picture, and it's far too fragile to actually, yeah, it's not really well preserved. But again, who knows, maybe we find more of this stuff. Then moving on to the Middle Kingdom, we actually have this, what was known before the excavations. We have a chapel of Mentuhotep II, the king who reunified the country during the 11th dynasty, and that chapel was situated sort of in this area here to the west of the temple. Our excavation area, just to remind you, was here, so it's on the other side, and there was a small chapel of the time of Mentuhotep II. And then we also know of a larger temple for which we have several limestone blocks naming King Amenemhat I, the founder of the 12th dynasty. And quite a few of these blocks of Amenemhat I were actually reused in the foundations of this Ptolemaic Isis temple, which makes you wonder whether one of the earliest structures was actually situated underneath the later Isis temple. And that's where we also continued the excavations. And there was always this curious mud brick wall just in front of the much later temple structure. And we were able, with the help of the pottery, here you can actually see the layout, we were able, with floor levels and ceramics, to date this to the Middle Kingdom. So there's certainly a Middle Kingdom phase here, and that belongs to this particular sanctuary. And this is the large enclosure wall I mentioned earlier, and you can see immediately the different orientation from the Roman temple. Very different, and has nothing to do with it, and dates also to the Middle Kingdom. And it actually, the Old Kingdom wall, where I said we had the corner, the Old Kingdom enclosure was situated right here. And the Middle Kingdom one is extending much further southwards, suddenly enlarging the area. And that would fit very well with what we have in front of the Isis temple, that suddenly there was this sanctuary that was put into place further south. Again, you can see it from this picture taken with the drone, very different alignment of the Middle Kingdom wall to the Hathor temple, and it usually gives you a very good indication that these two monuments don't go together at all. And then here's the foundation trench. I've marked this in yellow, where it's cutting right through the late Old Kingdom settlement layers. So we do have now some evidence for the earliest sanctuaries, just in form of perimeter walls, terminus walls, but at least it's giving us a pretty good idea that we also had a major activity of these two periods in the very close to the Hathor, Roman Hathor and Ptolemaic Isis temple. So this year, our focus was quite different. We left the temple enclosure wall and really ventured on the outside, on the exterior. And this is a huge area just to the east of the temple, as I was saying earlier, sandwiched in between an unexcavated temple complex to the east and the main well-known temple complex. And another pretty spectacular view, and much better than anything else I can think of to explain what happened here, is this view taken with our flying camera. You see the main temple area in the background, and then you see our excavation area of the ancient town right here. And basically what we can say now is that from the core of the Old Kingdom settlement being close to the temple, which makes a lot of sense, the site was gradually expanding in the 3rd millennium to the east. And it was using this probably higher lying sand formation. Again, we have a geomorphologist who's going to look at this more closely. What made people expand this town in this direction specifically? Was it because there's another temple structure in the vicinity, or is it simply an advantageous part to settle? Also interesting, you might see the different forms of vegetation on each side. So here you have a sort of grass-like vegetation, while this part, this green stuff, is called camel thorn, or the modern Egyptians call it shuk. It's something really annoying. It's very spiky, and if you don't have good pants, it actually really, yeah, not very comfortable to walk through, and especially some of our toll station points are in this area. Very annoying type of vegetation that can only be eaten by camels. I think that's why they call it camel thorn. And right in the middle is the archaeological area, and you can see also there's no particular protection here. The Antiquities Organization very much knows that this is an ancient site and it's forbidden to build on it, but there's no formal, there's no enclosure or marking of this specific area. So the focus was this excavating this large settlement quarter, which mainly dates to the first intermediate period. So here again, we have exactly the same phenomenon at Edfu, that at the end of the 6th dynasty, the town rapidly, actually fairly rapidly expands considerably, in this case to the east. And we are able to look at this specific period, which is, as I mentioned earlier, not very well known. And this is the only site in Egypt where you can excavate on a large extension a town dating to around 2100 BC. The size of the area is 65 by 50 meters. And because it's so different from Edfu, where we have a tell with a lot of settlement remains sitting on top of each other, here we can actually spread out and excavate on a much larger scale, because we are only dealing with 4 occupational phases. Very different and actually a little bit easier to dig too. The red area, this is actually where I started part of my archaeological career in 2001 and 2, excavating with a French team who were just focusing on one building. And the director at the time was looking for a Greco-Roman settlement and absolutely hated the idea that he found a first intermediate period one. He was not happy at all and abandoned this very quickly. But this site for me was always one of the most interesting settlements to excavate. And as you can see from the previous picture, if I just go back one, there is quite a bit of settlement still to explore. And we've just taken the easternmost part. I mean, this area here all awaits further exploration. Of course, there's some sabah digging there too, so you do have to deal with some holes and destruction, but, well, we're used to it by now. Then from the aerial view, which is again beautiful with this drone, we were able to discern already like the main streets, and you can see it's pretty well organized, but I would not go as far as saying this is a pre-planned settlement. Just because you have streets and right angles doesn't mean that there was a specific pre-fabricated plan to this. We also noticed that the houses are large, they can spread out, they don't have these restrictions like in Edfu being in a landscape where you don't have a lot of space. Here they were spreading out and building large courtyards, large houses, and nothing looks like these guys had to deal with an economic crisis. This is the excavation in progress. We had about 20 Egyptian workers and specialists who are actually fully trained archaeologists working with us at the site. And and then we have 2 major phases, one dating to the first intermediate period and a second one to the early Middle Kingdom, after which this part of the site is abandoned, which is also strange. And here's a reconstruction of one of the houses. Again, with our beautiful photo scan program, you get a 3D model, and you can see immediately the sort of organization with like 2 larger rooms, and in the center there's always a staircase here marked here. I've not seen that many staircases in a town before. It was just amazing. Almost every house there has a staircase, and you have to get used to excavating that too, because it looks quite different from the usual rooms you look at. And these staircases probably led to a roof. We don't think it was necessarily an upper floor because the walls are not that thick and might have not supported a second floor. But using the roof space is something that's quite typical for houses like this. And some of the objects, like, for example, the small animal figurine in clay, we couldn't quite figure out what kind of animal. It wasn't too specific, some 4-legged creature. And a little slate palette used for grinding pigment. And then also administrative activity, evidence for administrative activity. Here we have a pretty rare example for faience cylinder seal that was found, and it's trapped in its original between 2 floors, if I remember correctly. And you can see this is like a print of the cylinder seal. Pretty much figurative motifs, not really anything that looks very text-like, but again, this has not been studied properly. And then on the other side here, to the right, we have a lot of broken clay ceilings dating to the early Middle Kingdom. Again, testing for administrative activity. You see some of the back types have imprints of basketry, wood, and so on, really showing what kind of containers they were attached to. And then on the other side, you get these little imprints showing figurative motifs from the seals that used to stamp these.